So here's the yes or no question. And this is more from my own entertainment to what you respond to this. Do they understand Bitcoin? Do the people in these organizations understand Bitcoin?
6 months ago, I'd say no. But so recently, so the IMF has reports, annual reports of all their recipient countries of their loans, and they just monitor them and make sure that they're spending the funds the right way. And El Salvador's came out like 5 days ago, and I read it. And Bitcoin's mentioned 236 times in that report.
Wow.
And so they're on it now, because I think not only the legal tender, but the Bitcoin bond has them shook.
Yes.
Because they have had a monopoly on distressed sovereigns for a long, long time. And it's basically, like I said, it's a way for them to control the policies of these countries and to basically infringe on their sovereignty for a long, long time. And El Salvador is basically like a proof of concept in my mind. And they're on it now. So it's going to be really interesting how it plays out.
Well, one of the things that I think was totally missed with this bond down in El Salvador is the special coupon that is part of the deal. This special coupon is massive, hundreds of millions of dollars in value at the time of issuance of the bond itself. And so if you're a fixed income investor and you're chartered in fixed income, now all of a sudden you can get practically direct access to a portion of the amount that you're buying in the bond. In this case, I think it's 50%. They're raising $1 billion. Half of it is going straight into Bitcoin. It is a Bitcoin buy from the very first day that they received the funds. El Salvador is then custodying that Bitcoin and then paying it as a coupon at a date in the future. So now if you're a fixed income chartered entity, wherever you're at in the world, right, you now have direct access to Bitcoin-like performance, even though yields everywhere on the planet, because of organizations like the ones we're talking about, is nothing percent. I think it's a way, the structure of this bond is so intelligently constructed, and I don't think it's received nearly enough airtime on what the implications of that are because of the access that it provides to fixed income investors.
Yeah, I mean, in this low rate environment, it's kind of looking pretty attractive with the upside potential of just Bitcoin's price appreciation. And then you have 50%. Yeah, 50% of it's just Bitcoin, and the other 50% is infrastructure to build out their mining operations and the city. And so it kind of depends on their execution a little bit as well.
Yes,
in my mind.
But for El Salvador, it's no detriment to them to be a custody holder of something that they've declared as legal tender, right? Yeah. Organically inside of their jurisdiction, to custody that on behalf of that fixed income investor and then just hand it back to them at a later date. They're not out anything, right? But they've created an incentive structure to attract what I would describe as locked up capital that has to force itself into a zero yield environment. And now it's almost like a relief valve on a pressure tank that I think has never been there ever in a situation like this. It's totally crazy. I'm with you 100% on that comment about the bond being a big deal here.
Yeah, no, so we talk about, let's back up a little bit about the IMF. All right. So the IMF, I mean, it's amazing. There's basically two critiques of the IMF. One of them is, why do they exist when their original purpose no longer exists after 1971, right? Because they basically do the exact same job as the World Bank. They're both just like developmental agencies now, giving out loans to distressed third world countries and influencing their policy and advising them on what to do to achieve economic growth. And, you know, there's a long history of, the other thing is that their loans, you can make a really good argument that the IMF has not come through on their mission and reduce poverty and help these nations, but actually made their lives worse.
Yeah.
And there's statistics for it. Like, I'll give you an example. There's a study that looked at all the recipient countries who received loans from like 1947 to 1989. And it looked at how long the countries relied on the IMF. So the ideal situation is that they take the loan, they create economic growth, and they don't have to use the IMF again. They don't have to go into debt because the policies worked and they grew their way out of it, and they're self-sustainable, right? Well, 6 of those countries relied on the IMF every year for 30 plus years. And 24 countries relied on them from 20 to 29 years. And 47 countries relied on them from 10 to 19 years. And 83% or 83 of those developing nations who received IMF loans relied on the IMF every year for 60% of the years from 1947 to 1989. So it creates long-term dependence on these external, creditors. And so are they actually doing their job? And then do they actually create economic growth in these less developed countries? In another study they looked at from 1965 to 1995, they looked at about 48 out of the 90 loan recipient countries were not better off than before in terms of real per capita wealth. And 32 of those 48 countries, their economies actually shrunk by an average of 15% after they've received the loans from the IMF. And so there's real data to support the fact that is the IMF actually helping these countries? And I think when you look at El Salvador, El Salvador is finally trying to get themselves out of relying on the IMF. And they're using this open monetary network that doesn't have any gatekeepers, that is completely permissionless, to raise money and to use it the way they want to without any conditions attached to it, like the IMF loans. And, if you look at even since they made Bitcoin legal tender, 30% had bank accounts before Bitcoin became legal tender. And that's after 40 years of IMF and World Bank policies. 30% only had bank accounts. 4 months later, after making Bitcoin legal tender, that number has doubled. So they have doubled the amount of people who have access to financial service in 4 months, what the IMF and World Bank policies did in 40 years. And so this is a huge deal.
Insane. It's
insane. It's insane. And they estimate that the potential benefits of remittances alone could save them about 0.25% of GDP a year. So about $54 million in savings back to Salvadorians by using the Bitcoin. And they expect Bitcoin tourism to bring in an additional, $5 million a year, and which isn't a lot, but still, this is a man who's trying to lead his country and bring in innovation and use a new technology to bring in entrepreneurship. And the IMF is sitting there and they're their arms are crossed and they're like, no, because they don't like it because they've had a monopoly on this distressed sovereign debt for so long. And what they're really worried about is other nations looking at El Salvador and being like, this is interesting. I don't like the IMF either. They've actually made our lives really hard for the last 30 years. Let's try something different. And that is a huge deal to me. And I'm very empathetic to the millions of faceless and nameless victims of these policies throughout the entire world, from the IMF and the World Bank. And to see them take their sovereign rights back into their own hands and use Bitcoin to do that, I mean, it makes me incredibly excited. Incredibly excited.
It's crazy to understand that stat, that you're doubling the remittance or the number of people with a bank account access in 4 months, but yet the IMF is still making statements telling them that they think that this is bad policy or whatever the heck it is that they're saying. That's
Right.
that's I don't have a word for it other than disgust.
Well, it raises the question, the question that a lot of people have had for a long time, is what the true intentions of these organizations are, because it doesn't seem like it is to help the people of these developed nations. It seems to be very, very different. And you know, one example, parasitic self-interest, as well as pillaging the wealth of these nations. And so the chief economist of the World Bank, Joseph Stiglitz, in the 90s, he was one of the first whistleblowers of these policies. He came out in 1999. He was the first one that had really high ranking in these organizations, Nobel Prize winning economist. He said, we need to reform these policies because they are doing the opposite of what the goals are. They are worsening these third world countries. He said there's basically a 4-step process here. They basically privatize state-owned assets and industries, particularly electricity and water companies, and in a process that involves a ton of backhand deal, handshakes behind doors and significant amount of corruption, and then he basically explains how they open up the third world countries with deregulation and liberalization, opens up their financial markets, which allows capital flows to go into these nations. And then once things hits the fan and there's a recession, all the money flows out. It's a hot money cycle, and all the capital flows go out and all the investment. And then the IMF recommends that they increase the interest rates. And then suddenly the interest rates go up 60, 70, 80% in these countries, and the economies are just wrecked. And this happens over and over and over again. And then when there's a recession after it's wrecked, the IMF recommends austerity. They recommend cutting spending. And what they cut is subsidies for food, essential consumer products. They cut everything, all the healthcare programs, all the education programs, in order for these countries to afford to repay their IMF debt. So they take all the programs that are meant to help the poor, and they cut them to pay off the debts that they brought on these people. And that happens time and time again. And if you know anything about the history of the IMF, after they do that and they cut the subsidies, it leads to riots, it leads to protests, it leads to civil unrest. In the 1980s and 1990s, there was literally a term called IMF riots because they were so frequent. In 1976 to 1992, there was 146 IMF-sponsored riots against IMF-sponsored programs in almost 40 different countries. So when we say these things, that they hurt the poor people and hurt these developing nations, like, the data supports it, and their track record is not pretty. And so this has been going on for a very, very long time. And so to see El Salvador finally stand up against these people and use a technology finally that's there that they can use, that they don't have to ask permission, they don't have to ask the IMF, can I do this? But they just did it. It's incredibly empowering for these third world countries. And I just don't think people really understand the history of how hard of a time these third world countries have had dealing with these organizations.
That was one heck of a response to the yes or no question. I was trying to have a little fun with you, and you had a whopper of a response.